In California this past week, there was a giant oil spill. I believe the town was Huntington, California. And essentially, a pipeline burst there. Oil got onto the beaches. It got into the water. There were, sign like "Do not swim" signs put out. Animals were covered in oil. Obviously, this is a giant tragedy. And by the way, it's not necessarily a surprise when an oil pipeline leaks, because all oil pipelines are going to leak at some point, right? They just they're volatile. They have a lot of liquid going through them. That liquid is often volatile in its own way. And regardless of how you store this particular, regardless of what storage mechanism you use to prevent an oil spill, it is almost guaranteed that at some point the pipeline is going to break or something else is going to happen. And this is for a number of reasons. The most obvious of which is plate tectonics, right? The movement of the continents throughout the earth, right? The planet is constantly shifting and evolving and things. And if you place these pipelines underground that have these toxic chemicals going through them, eventually the earth is going to move and it's going to break, right? So just from a practical perspective, pipelines on their own are bad because, they're always going to break. There will always be a break somewhere, and you just kind of hope it's not near you and not in your drinking supply, which, of course, is the main frustration of many indigenous peoples who are living next to pipelines, which is oftentimes their water and their sacred lands get polluted by oil, because oil in a pipeline will spill eventually. It's a tautology. It always happens. Even if the pipeline has been going good for 100 years, at some point it will not be. Okay, it's just the way of things. So, and look, if you disagree, I'm happy to argue that with you, but it's true. It just is. At some point, every pipeline that is created that to bring oil is going to leak oil. It just will. There's really no getting around it. It's unfortunate, but it happens. So the question is, what should we do about it? Well, I would say the most obvious thing to do about it is to stop new pipelines from being built, to cut off the current set of pipelines and rip them out of the ground. If we have to transport oil, which we shouldn't be doing anyway for climate reasons, but if we have to do it, at least then maybe use trucks or use trains or use a different type of transportation mechanism that is much less likely to cause massive environmental damage. So if we are going to stick with fossil fuels, if we are going to stick with oil, which again, we cannot do, it is literally killing us and our home on this planet. But for the time being, we have to be smarter about how we transport this, this liquid around. The other thing we can do, other than the most obvious thing, is we can bring back what's called the corporate death penalty. So what is the corporate death penalty? So if you think about corporate punishment, fines and things, what typically ends up happening is that a company does a bad thing, they go to court, and the court says you need to pay a fine of X number of dollars. The problem is, oftentimes, these corporations are so large and so profitable that a variety of things happens. One, the fine does not impact them at all. Two, the fine is so small after negotiation that it doesn't really help anyone. And these things create problems, obviously, because unless a corporation, well, it's like anyone, right? If you punish someone by just slapping them on the wrist or telling them, wagging your finger at them like, hey, don't do that next time, well, you haven't really suffered any for your, for your malady. So you're more likely to do it again, which just kind of an obvious, makes obvious sense. So we need to do something that will actually impact these corporations, right? And one of the things we can do, other than just arresting people at high levels of them, is to bring back the corporate death penalty. So the corporate death penalty is essentially when you do something so heinous and so bad, and mind you, look, there's not a ton of things that are going to fit into this category, right? But it does warrant a discussion about kind of what does. And I would actually say an oil spill is pretty, or even multiple oil spills, I think is pretty good reason to bring back the corporate death penalty and to say that, look, that's actually something that you can get the corporate death penalty for. So what the corporate death penalty does is it says to everyone that's there, okay, well, we tried finding you, we tried doing these other things. Clearly, we're not able to teach you any lessons. The corporation is now dissolved. Its assets are sold off and is sheeted to the state, or in the case of an oil spill, right, the assets are sold off and used to clean up the oil spill. The top of the company goes to jail and everyone loses their jobs and the corporation ceases to exist, right? That's more or less what the corporate death penalty is. Now, if you're thinking about building a pipeline in an area that's dangerous, or just building a pipeline generally, because as I said, they will leak eventually, maybe you think twice about that, right? Because when it does leak, or if it leaks more than once, perhaps, whatever we want to make the rule, you go to prison and the company goes kaput. It's just gone, disappears, vanishes, right? Can you imagine if, now look, corporations are easy to set up. So, it's difficult to say that you would stop the behavior for very long, but at least then you have cut off the head of the snake. You make it much more difficult for that company specifically and the people at the top to do bad again, because they're in prison, the company has disappeared, and their assets have been and the assets have been gotten rid of, essentially to make sure that whoever is executing the company can use the resources to kind of clean up the company's messes. Again, because it's so easy to set up a corporation, I'm not sure how long this would solve the problem for, but essentially, if you do this, you start to imprison some very rich people. And you start to introduce real punishments into a system which effectively has been, up until this point, a cost of doing business problem. As I said earlier, because these fines are so small, oftentimes corporations just write them in their budgets, or they write a legal budget in saying, hey, we're going to spend this much on lawsuits this year, which is problematic because it obviously hasn't taken away the incentive to do bad things, right? It has only created a situation where bad things are just slightly more expensive to do. But we don't want bad things to be slightly more expensive to do. We want bad things to stop happening. And the way that we do that is we actually make it almost impossible for a company to, in good faith, say, we're going to do the bad thing. And by the way, this takes advantage of capitalism too, right? If you need to return, if you're a public company and you need returns every quarter, or you're a CEO and you're afraid of what the board will say, obviously putting the company in danger of being literally executed is going to be bad for you as a CEO. You can actually start to curb this behavior just from the threat of the corporate death penalty, or making an example out of one company, because word spreads, right? And especially, like, can you imagine what CNBC would be like if we, executed a company? That would be amazing. The word would spread so fast among rich people. Oh my God, your head would spin, right? As Trump would say. It would be awesome, because you would essentially send a very strong message saying this type of behavior, and behaviors that impact, people like this one did, will cause you to lose everything. And if you're a rational actor, that's just not a decision. That's not a risk you're willing to take, right? It's almost impossible to justify that, right? To say that, hey, our risk appetite is total dissolution of the company. So you force people to take more conservative positions, which is to say, maybe we shouldn't do that thing because the consequences are so high. Whereas nowadays, oh, we can do this, we can do this dangerous thing because, what's the worst that could happen? They fine us for a couple $1,000,000. We've already made billions of dollars, so there's no point. It doesn't stop them any. So anyway, we haven't had the corporate death penalty in a very long time, but I think it's about time that we bring it back. And I hope that you think of the Huntington, California story, as well as other stories of corporations that have done very bad things. I would argue DuPont probably, and 3M probably deserve the corporate death penalty, as well as their subsidiaries and spin-off corporations, right, who do horrible things and pollute our water and things. And just think to yourself, what types of crimes against regular people would you want corporations to be executed over? Is it oil spills? Is it Starting forest fires like PG&E did? Is it putting hazardous pollutants in our water like DuPont and 3M did? Is it painting our houses with lead like has been done for a long time? Is it asbestos, right? As Navy contractors put in ships and all these naval officers and sailors got sick, right? There are lots of things that you can think of where large number. Is it the Sacklers, the opioids, right? I mean, the Sacklers and their company, who Purdue Pharma, didn't get the corporate death penalty. Sure, they were converted to a B corporation, but that company should have been executed, right? Everyone should have gone to prison. All the assets should have been dissolved and given to survivors. You can think of situations where the corporate death penalty would be useful in the way that I'm thinking about it. So I highly encourage you to think about it in this way and to think about, hey, how can we punish corporations differently, right? Because if we are going to sit in this capitalist model, by the way, this may even be true in a socialist model, right? I mean, not, if we're going to continue to punish corporations for bad things they do, which I think we should, then we need to do it in a way that's actually going to stop new corporations from doing new bad things. So, long and the short of it, bring back the corporate death penalty. It's time.